Educated is a memoir. It's about me. I was raised on a really beautiful mountain in southern Idaho. I was the youngest of 7 children. And in a lot of ways, it was a really beautiful childhood. The mountain was beautiful. We spent a lot of hours walking on the mountain when I was young, picking herbs from my mother, who's a midwife and an herbalist. My dad had a junkyard, which when I was young was kind of an exotic playground. So there was a lot of beauty in my childhood. But my dad also had some really radical beliefs. And because of those beliefs, we were isolated. So I was never allowed to go to school or to the doctor. I didn't even have a birth certificate until I was 9 years old. When I was 16, I made the decision to try to educate myself. So I taught myself enough grammar and mathematics to take the ACT, which is the college admissions exam in the United States. And somehow I was admitted to university. And what I didn't know at the time was I was starting out on a path of education that would take me to some of the best universities in the world, to Harvard, to Cambridge. That path would also take me away from my family. And then I would have to ask myself some really difficult questions, like what does it mean to belong to a family, and what are the obligations that we owe to our family? And probably the most difficult of all, what do you do when you find that the obligations that you owe to your family are somehow in conflict with what you owe to yourself? So as I became more and more educated, I was becoming more mainstream, and my family was becoming more extreme. So they were living in a more and more extreme way. They were isolating themselves further from doctors, developing more extreme views about the government, about school. And eventually what would happen is there would be a break between me and my family. And that would come about because of a relationship I had with my older brother. Because I would confront my parents with the fact that my brother was violent, and my parents would choose not to believe me about that violence. And the result would be that I would lose half my family. And when I was experiencing that process of estrangement, that incredibly difficult process of losing some of my family, I felt isolated. I felt really alone. I felt like I was the only person that had ever happened to. Now I know that that's not true. It happens to a lot of people. But at the time I felt really alone, and I wish that there were stories out there, that there were more stories about people talking about estrangement and about the difficult decisions that they had to make. Because I think stories are really important. I think they tell us who we are and how we're supposed to feel, when we're supposed to feel proud, when we're supposed to feel ashamed. And I was having this difficult experience where I was losing my family, and I was trying to work out, how can I believe that I'm a good person when I know that my mother doesn't believe that I'm a good person? And I didn't feel like there were stories for that. I didn't feel like there were enough stories about how you can believe in yourself when the people who are close to you no longer believe in you. And since I couldn't find that story, eventually I decided that I would write it. I miss a lot of things from my old life. My family, they're really good people, and I don't think this is a story about bad people doing bad things. I think it's a story about what good people do to keep secrets. So there are a lot of things I miss about my life. The love in my family was real, and the good qualities about my family, about my father, my mother, even my brother who was violent, they're full, complicated people. And I love them. And I think the love is one of the things that makes it so difficult to leave, because it is a real loss. It's a loss the loss of an abusive relationship is just as much a loss as any other kind of relationship, or it feels like that. It definitely feels like that. So when I was a child, I mostly read, the Bible and Mormon scriptures. I didn't read a lot of books. It wasn't until I left my family and went to the university that I began to read more. And I think, what education did for me is it gave me access to different ideas and different perspectives and different ways of understanding the world. When I was a child, I hadn't had access to different points of view. I didn't go to school, so the only history I learned was the history that my father taught me. When I went to college, when I went to the university, that's when I got access to different histories, different ways of interpreting the past. And I think ultimately that would give me a kind of confidence or or that the ability to have ideas that were different from the people around me. And that was something that when I was a child I didn't have. My father's ideas about the world were the exact same as my ideas about the world. And I think what my education gave me was that ability to trust in my own mind and trust in my own perspective and my own experiences. I think quite late, I think that there were a lot of years I thought that I could somehow walk the line and change and grow and become different and still somehow belong to that place, to that family. I think there were a lot of years I thought I could leave the mountain and then live as though I'd never left, that I could read and think for myself and still live like a child at my father's feet, or that I could go travel the world and go see the world and then live as if I hadn't seen it. And it took me a long time to realize that the thing about education is that it really does change who you are, and it changes your ideas, and it really makes you into a different person. And it's not always possible to go back and live your old life the way that you did before. I think there's always a price to be paid for real change, and in my case, it was a pretty high price. I'm not sure I could pick a moment when I felt like my life could be different. I think sometimes it's always hard actually to imagine a different life, to imagine that life could be different from the life that you have. In some ways, I think it's just an act of faith to let go of what's in front of you and trust that you can have a different future. One of my favorite scriptures, I title one of my chapters, "The Substance of Things," is that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the essence of things not seen. And I think for me, when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to change my family culture, that I wasn't going to be able to move my family away from the habits that we had of secrecy and violence, that really what I had to do was just believe that another world was possible, even though I hadn't fully seen it. And to me, I think that became a different idea of faith than the one I'd been raised with. That is to say, faith in something hoped for, but not yet seen. I didn't start writing until, I've always written in a journal, which is quite different. Actually, it's a really different kind of writing. I wrote for myself. I wrote for catharsis, to help me remember things, to mark the passage of time. I didn't write in any serious way until I decided to write the book. And then writing wasn't so much an escape as a way to try to make sense of the past, to try to understand what had happened and try to find some meaning in it, try to work out what it meant. I'd had a very difficult thing happen to me. I'd lost half my family, and I needed to try to understand why that had happened and what it meant, if it meant anything. People like to ask me what I want people to take away from my story, from my book. And I always say, I want people to take away from the book whatever feels right for them. I think people have to navigate difficult relationships, difficult families, different ideas of learning and change and becoming an identity. And again, I think stories are out there so that we can put ourselves in the positions of other people and think about the decisions other people made and use those stories to try to work out what we think about our own lives. And in that way, I think people can take from my story whatever message resonates with them. And I really don't mind. I think that that's what stories are for. I think I don't necessarily have one message that I think people should take from my story, because I think all stories, if they really mean something to a person, they become, I think, merged, that person's story. And then the message of those two stories is going to be different and unique. And I'm really comfortable with the idea that what people will take out of my story might have nothing to do with my story, might have nothing to do with me. And I think that's what stories are supposed to do.